At 8:23 on the morning of September 8, 1946, Private Dieter Schneider stood in the processing yard at Lodge Moor Camp near Sheffield, watching British guards hand out work assignments to the line of German prisoners. 25 years old, trained as a vintner in the Rhineland, captured at the Rhine crossing 18 months earlier. Dieter had spent the months since Germany's surrender preparing himself for what came next: coal mines in Wales, stone quarries in Scotland, maybe clearing rubble in bombed British cities his countrymen had destroyed. The other prisoners had told him the British treated POWs fairly, but Dieter knew what defeat meant: punishment work. Back-breaking labour designed to demonstrate German failure while rebuilding what Germany had shattered. The guard called his name. Dieter stepped forward. The guard handed him a slip of paper with an address in Sussex and 4 words written in English: Vineyard restoration work detail. Dieter read the paper twice. He turned to the prisoner next to him, a lance corporal from Stuttgart named Martin Keller. "They're sending us to work vineyards," Dieter said, "like farmhands, like common labourers in the fields." Martin stared at his own assignment slip. His face went pale. "This is the insult," Martin said. "They're mocking us, making trained men grovel in the dirt like peasants." Dieter had worked his family's vineyard since he was 14, understanding the chemistry of wine, the precision of pruning, the craft of turning grapes into something exceptional. His hands were made for skilled work, for careful judgment. Now the British wanted him to dig in dirt. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. At least it wasn't a firing squad. What Dieter didn't know was that within 2 years, he would be managing that same vineyard. That Martin would be running a wine import business in London, serving the finest restaurants in Britain. That the insult Dieter feared would become the opportunity that saved his life and introduced him to the country he would call home. The German prisoners had been arriving in Britain since 1944. Most came from the final campaigns. Battle-hardened soldiers captured at the Rhine, the Ruhr, Hamburg, the complete collapse of the Wehrmacht. The British held them in camps across England, processing thousands of defeated German soldiers every month. Lodge Moor received hundreds of German POWs every week through 1946. The prisoners expected what prisoners always expected: brutal conditions, degrading labour. Work assignments designed to punish them for losing while supporting British recovery efforts without violating Geneva Convention rules. Instead, the British sent them to vineyards, orchards, farms, and food production facilities across southern England. The assignments confused the Germans. Some thought it was temporary, that harder labour would come after harvest season. Others thought the British were conducting psychological warfare, testing how German prisoners responded to humiliation before assigning real punishment work. Dieter arrived at the Sussex vineyard on September 11, 1946. The property covered 180 acres of south-facing slopes planted with vines that had been neglected during 6 years of war. The owner was a man named Charles Pemberton, 64 years old, third-generation wine producer, whose family had been making English wine since 1880. Pemberton met Dieter and 8 other German prisoners at the estate entrance. He had a truck waiting to transport them to the worker quarters. Dieter expected barracks. He got converted estate cottages with shared rooms, running water, coal stoves, and a communal kitchen. The guards told them they would work 6 days per week, 9 hours per day, during restoration season. Pay was 1 shilling 6pence per day in camp credits that could be used to purchase cigarettes, soap, writing materials, and personal items from the camp commissary. Sundays were free. Dieter listened to this explanation and waited for the other shoe to drop. The hidden cruelty, the trap that would make sense of why the British were treating enemy soldiers like hired workers instead of defeated captives. The work began the next morning. Pemberton's vineyard manager, a man named Henry Collins, whose father had managed this same estate before the Great War, gathered the prisoners at dawn and explained the job. The vineyard had been neglected since 1940. The prisoners would work in teams rehabilitating the vines, removing dead wood, retraining growth patterns, repairing the trellis systems. Be gentle with the vines, each one is decades old. Quality matters more than speed. When a section was complete, move to the next row. Dieter had worked vineyards his entire life. He'd learned viticulture from his grandfather, mastered pruning techniques, understood how to coax the best fruit from difficult conditions. But he'd never seen vines this neglected, this damaged by years of abandonment. He partnered with Martin, and they started down their assigned row. The morning was cool, damp with English mist. The vines sprawled chaotically, 6 years of uncontrolled growth creating tangled masses. Dieter used his pruning shears carefully, identifying the main trunk, removing dead wood, selecting which canes to preserve. The work was methodical, almost meditative. No guards shouting, no impossible quotas, just the quiet concentration of skilled work, requiring judgment. By midday, Dieter had rehabilitated 12 vines. His hands ached from the shears. His back hurt from bending, but the pain was different from military labour. Purposeful, somehow. Creative, rather than destructive. Henry Collins came through the rows at lunchtime with sandwiches and tea. The prisoners sat beneath an oak tree and ate. Dieter expected minimal rations, but the sandwiches were substantial with cheese and vegetables, the tea hot and sweet. Martin ate his sandwich without speaking, then turned to Dieter. "This makes no sense," Martin said. "Why are they treating us like valuable workers?" Dieter didn't understand either. The work was real. The vineyard would be restored to production, creating wine that British people would drink and enjoy. The British were using German expertise to rebuild their wine industry, but they were paying for it. Treating the prisoners like employees, not slaves. Dieter had spent 4 months in a British POW camp in Germany after capture. The British had treated him correctly according to Geneva Convention standards, but there had been clear hierarchy, guards and prisoners. Victors and defeated. Obvious lines of authority and submission. Here in Sussex, the lines were blurred. The guards were present but distant. They transported the prisoners to work each morning and collected them each evening. But during work hours, they mostly stayed near the estate office, drinking tea and reading newspapers. Henry Collins gave instructions, but he gave them the way a vineyard manager gives instructions to seasonal workers, not the way a captor gives orders to prisoners. He explained techniques. He demonstrated methods. He asked if the Germans had questions about the work. That first week, Dieter worked the vineyard rows and tried to understand the British logic. Maybe this was efficiency. Maybe the British had calculated that treating prisoners well produced better quality work than treating them harshly. Or maybe the British simply needed workers desperately. Most British men had died in the war or were still serving overseas. The country needed every available worker for reconstruction. On Sunday, September 15th, Dieter and Martin took the transport truck back to Lodge Moor. They attended a chapel service led by a German-speaking Lutheran pastor, then visited the camp commissary. Dieter spent 1 shilling of his week's wages on cigarettes and writing paper. He wrote a letter to his mother in the Rhineland. He told her he was safe working in a vineyard, that the British were treating him fairly. He did not tell her that he was confused, that he didn't understand why defeat felt less degrading than some harvests he'd worked as a free man in Germany. The change began in October. The vine restoration was progressing faster than expected. Dieter assumed the British would reassign prisoners to different work once the initial rehabilitation was complete. Instead, Charles Pemberton asked Henry Collins to select 4 prisoners with viticulture or wine production experience for extended assignment through the winter pruning and spring planting season. Collins interviewed the 9 German prisoners individually. He asked about their backgrounds, their skills, their knowledge of wine production. Dieter told Collins he was a vintner, that he'd grown up in vineyards, that he understood every aspect of wine production from soil to bottle. Collins wrote this down, then asked if Dieter would be interested in staying through the full production cycle. Dieter said yes. because refusing seemed both foolish and impossible. 3 days later, Collins announced the selections. Dieter was one of the 4. He would remain at Pemberton's vineyard indefinitely, assisting with all aspects of vineyard management and wine production. Martin was not selected. He was being reassigned to a distribution warehouse in London, working with food supplies and logistics. Martin was angry. "Warehouse work," he said to Dieter the night before transfer, "like I'm some common labourer, like my education means nothing." The next morning, Martin left on the truck with the other 5 prisoners. Dieter never saw him again during his time in the POW system. Years later, Dieter would learn that Martin had impressed the warehouse managers, that he'd been promoted to logistics coordinator within a year, that he'd eventually started his own wine import company and become one of London's most successful wine merchants. But in October 1946, Martin left bitter, convinced he was being punished. Dieter stayed at the vineyard. The work changed after the selections. Now it was comprehensive vineyard management, winter pruning operations, soil preparation, pest management, preparing for the next growing season. Henry Collins taught Dieter English viticulture techniques, explained how to adapt continental methods to English conditions, showed him how to maximize quality from marginal climate conditions. The work required expertise, creativity, problem-solving. Dieter found himself enjoying it. The vineyard had logic. Like any living system had logic. You had to understand the plant, respect the seasons, work with nature rather than against it. In November, Dieter met Sir Edmund Wycliffe. Wycliffe was 58 years old, president of the English Vineyard Association, advisor to the Ministry of Agriculture on wine production recovery. He'd come to Sussex to inspect Pemberton's restoration work and assess whether government support should be expanded. Pemberton introduced Dieter as one of his workers, mentioned that Dieter had German training, that his expertise had been invaluable. Wycliffe spoke excellent German, learned from pre-war wine trading expeditions through the Rhineland and Moselle regions. He asked Dieter about his background. Dieter told him about the Rhineland, about his family's small vineyard, about the traditional methods his grandfather had taught him. Wycliffe listened, then said something that confused Dieter. "You're fortunate you ended up here," Wycliffe said. "After the war, English wine industry will need experienced vintners desperately. We lost nearly everyone. If you know wine production, there will be opportunities." Dieter didn't know what to say to that. He was a prisoner of war working in a vineyard because he'd been captured and assigned this labour. Fortune didn't seem like the right word for it. But Wycliffe was serious. He explained that English wine production had nearly died during the war. Vineyards had been abandoned. Expertise had been lost. Equipment had deteriorated. But that would change. Britain wanted to reduce dependence on French imports. They needed to rebuild domestic wine production. They would need experienced vintners who understood traditional methods, who could train the next generation, who could restore quality standards. "Germans know wine," Wycliffe said. "You grow up with it in your blood. You understand the craft. That knowledge is valuable here, regardless of politics." Dieter thanked Wycliffe for the conversation, but he didn't take it seriously. He was a prisoner of war. Eventually he would return to Germany. He would resume his work at the family vineyard. England was temporary, a strange interlude in his life that would end when repatriation began. In December 1946, Dieter's understanding began to change. A local family, the Harrisons, invited several prisoners from the vineyard to Sunday dinner at their home in Lewes. The Harrisons were wine enthusiasts, family that had supported English viticulture for generations. They had lost their only son at Normandy, but they wanted to meet the German prisoners, share a meal with young men far from home, demonstrate that not all British families defined people by their nationality. Dieter accepted the invitation along with 2 other prisoners. The guards approved it. The Harrisons collected them at the vineyard on Sunday afternoon and drove them to a Georgian townhouse on High Street. Inside, the smell of cooking filled every room. Roasted beef, Yorkshire pudding, vegetables from the garden, fresh bread. Dieter hadn't smelled food like that since leaving Germany. The Harrisons treated the prisoners not as enemies, but as guests. The father, Robert, shook Dieter's hand and welcomed him in careful German. The mother, Eleanor, insisted he looked too thin, that young men needed proper feeding after such terrible times. There was one daughter, Catherine, 22 years old, working as a teacher at a school in Brighton, helping educate children whose fathers hadn't returned from the war. They sat at a long table in the dining room. Robert opened a bottle of wine from Pemberton's Vineyard, vintage 1939, the last good year before the war. He poured glasses for everyone, including the prisoners. Dieter sipped the wine and felt something break inside him. Not quite sadness, but a kind of recognition. The wine tasted like home. The food tasted like home. The warmth of this family's hospitality, even extended to an enemy soldier, reminded him of everything he'd lost when he put on a uniform and went to war. Robert asked Dieter about his family in the Rhineland. Dieter told him about his mother, his younger sister, his father, who had been killed in North Africa in 1942. His older brother was missing somewhere in Russia. Last letter received in December 1944, with nothing since. Robert nodded. He understood. War had destroyed families, created impossible situations where decent people found themselves on opposite sides. But here in this dining room in Sussex, those divisions didn't matter as much. Robert poured more wine. Eleanor brought out another course. Catherine asked Dieter about the Rhineland, about his family's vineyard, about whether it had survived the Allied occupation. Dieter answered honestly. He told her about the vineyard, about his father's traditional methods, about the day he received his conscription notice and knew his winemaking days were ending. He told her about the war, about the fighting at the Rhine, about the moment when he surrendered because continuing to fight meant dying for nothing. Catherine listened without judgment. Then she said something that surprised him. "My brother died fighting your country," she said. "But you're not responsible for that. You're just a person who wanted to make wine and got forced into a war. I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you're here making wine again instead of dead in France." Dieter didn't know how to respond to that. He'd expected hatred. He'd expected British families to blame him for their losses. Instead, this family was offering him compassion. Robert laughed at Dieter's expression. "English people are practical," Robert said. "Hating you won't bring back our son. Treating you badly won't restore our vineyards. But working together, sharing knowledge, building something beautiful, maybe that prevents the next war. Maybe that's worth more." Dieter thought about that. He thought about Henry Collins teaching him English techniques, treating him like a colleague rather than a prisoner. He thought about Charles Pemberton paying him wages, the same rate British workers received. He thought about Sir Edmund Wycliffe telling him there would be opportunities after the war, as if Dieter's status as a defeated enemy mattered less than his knowledge of wine. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe the British did think differently about enemies, about defeat, about what it meant to rebuild after catastrophic war. And maybe that difference explained why Dieter's punishment felt less like captivity and more like the most meaningful work he'd ever done. The dinner lasted 5 hours. When it ended, Robert insisted Dieter take a bottle of the 1939 wine back to the vineyard. "For you and the other lads," Robert said, "so you remember, there's still beauty in the world, even after everything." Dieter took the wine. That night, he shared it with the other prisoners in the cottage. They passed the bottle around, each man taking a small drink. Nobody spoke much. There was nothing to say. The wine said everything. In January 1947, Henry Collins started treating Dieter differently, not paying him more because wages were fixed by international agreements, but finding ways to show recognition. Better tools from the estate supplies, extra rations from the main house kitchen, small privileges like access to Pemberton's wine library. Collins called it professional respect. He said skilled workers deserved good treatment regardless of nationality, that it was simply good management. Dieter began to understand something important. The British weren't being generous out of moral principle. They were being pragmatic. They needed wine expertise. They had skilled prisoners. Using that expertise efficiently required treating the prisoners well enough that they would work productively and share their knowledge willingly. It was calculation, not charity, but the result was the same. Dieter ate well. He slept in a comfortable cottage. He learned valuable skills. He saved his wages in camp credits. Accumulated over £18 by May 1947. In June 1947, the British government announced new policies for German POW repatriation. Low-risk prisoners could apply to remain in Britain under supervised work programs if they had employment sponsors and valuable skills. The official POW status would be converted to civilian work permits. Charles Pemberton spoke to Dieter in July 1947. Pemberton wanted to discuss the future. The vineyard was expanding. The success of the restoration had convinced investors to fund new plantings. 120 additional acres would be developed over the next 3 years. The expansion would require experienced vintners, people who understood every aspect of wine production, people who could be trusted to manage operations independently. Pemberton offered Dieter a permanent position once his POW status could be officially resolved and proper work permits arranged. Salary would be £10 per week, plus housing in one of the estate cottages, plus a percentage of profits if production exceeded targets. Pemberton said Dieter had proven himself exceptionally capable and trustworthy. Pemberton said he'd rather employ someone he knew than gamble on unknown workers. Dieter asked if this offer was legal. Pemberton said he'd consulted with immigration authorities. Former enemy POWs could apply to remain in Britain if they had employment sponsors and could demonstrate they posed no security risk. Pemberton would sponsor Dieter. Dieter asked for time to think about it. Pemberton gave him until August. Dieter spent that month wrestling with the decision: return to Germany or stay in England. Home or opportunity. Everything he knew or everything he could become. He wrote to his mother. The letter took 7 weeks to reach the French occupation zone. His mother's response took another 9 weeks to arrive. When it came in October, Dieter opened it with shaking hands. His mother's letter was 3 pages long. She described the Rhineland under French occupation. The vineyard barely functioning, most equipment stolen or destroyed, food scarce, work scarce, future uncertain. Dieter's brother had been confirmed dead in Russia, killed in early 1945. His sister had married and moved to Hamburg. His mother was living with his aunt, both women working in a textile factory for minimal wages. His mother's final paragraph was direct. There is nothing for you here. The vineyard is destroyed. Wine work does not exist. Your skills will not be needed for years, maybe longer. If you have opportunity in England, take it. Build a life. Send money if you can, but do not return to this ruin. Dieter read the letter 3 times. Then he walked to Charles Pemberton's office and accepted the job offer. Dieter was officially released from POW status in December 1947. He signed an employment contract with Pemberton Vineyards in January 1948. He received his British work permit in February 1948. He became a permanent resident of the United Kingdom in June 1948. By July 1948, Dieter Schneider was no longer a German prisoner of war. He was a vineyard manager in Sussex, earning £10 per week, plus housing, plus a percentage of profits from England's finest wine production. Dieter worked for Pemberton for 8 years. He learned British business practices. He learned how to manage seasonal workers, negotiate with distributors, market premium wine to discriminating customers. In 1955, Pemberton offered Dieter a partnership. 25% ownership of the vineyard in exchange for Dieter's continued management and a £4,000 investment. Dieter had saved £4,600 over 7 years of work. He accepted the partnership. By 1962, Pemberton Vineyards was producing some of the highest quality English wine in the country. Sir Edmund Wycliffe. who Dieter had met in 1946, now chaired the English Vineyard Association and regularly cited Pemberton's wines as examples of what English viticulture could achieve. Wycliffe remembered Dieter from that first meeting. "I told you English wine would need experienced Germans," Wycliffe said. "I told you there would be opportunities." "You didn't believe me then." Dieter remembered. In 1968, Dieter's share of the vineyard's annual profit was £6,800, more money than his father had earned in his entire lifetime of winemaking in the Rhineland. Dieter never returned to Germany. He sent money to his mother every month until she died in 1965. He sponsored his sister's immigration to England in 1956. She settled in London, married an English accountant. Dieter attended the wedding and met several other former German POWs who had stayed in Britain after the war. Some worked in agriculture, some worked in hospitality, some owned their own businesses. All of them told similar stories. They had arrived expecting punishment. They had received opportunity instead. Dieter met Catherine Harrison again in 1950. She was still teaching, running a small school in Brighton now, educating the children of post-war families. They encountered each other at a wine tasting event in Lewes. She remembered him from the dinner in 1946. They talked about wine, about education, about building futures from ruins. They had coffee, then dinner, then more coffee and more dinners. They married in 1952. Catherine's parents attended the wedding. Robert Harrison walked Catherine down the aisle, then shook Dieter's hand and welcomed him to the family. "No hard feelings," Robert said. "You're making beautiful wine. That's what matters now." Dieter and Catherine had 2 children. Both learned German from their father. Both learned about wine from their father. Dieter taught them about viticulture, about winemaking, about the craft his grandfather had taught him. In 1975, Dieter purchased Charles Pemberton's remaining 75% of the vineyard. Pemberton was 93 years old, ready to retire. No children interested in continuing the business. He sold to Dieter for fair market value, plus a clause in the contract that the vineyard would keep Pemberton's name for 1 generation. Dieter agreed. Pemberton had given him a chance when he was a prisoner of war, with no prospects and no future. Keeping the name was the least Dieter could do. By 1980, Pemberton Vineyards, under Dieter's management, covered 300 acres of premium wine production in Sussex. The wine sold across Britain and Europe. Wine critics ranked Dieter's production among the finest English wines ever made. Dieter employed 35 workers, managed 4 separate production facilities, and served on the board of directors for the English Vineyard Association. He was 59 years old. He had started as a prisoner of war, assigned to what he thought was humiliating labour in a neglected vineyard. He had become one of the most successful wine producers in Britain. Dieter's story was not unique. Records show that approximately 3,500 German POWs worked in British agriculture and food production during and after the war. Hundreds stayed after repatriation became possible. Many became successful farmers, vintners, and business owners. The exact numbers are difficult to verify because many former POWs didn't publicise their backgrounds. They simply integrated into British communities, married British women, raised British children, and built lives. But the pattern is clear. German prisoners arrived in Britain expecting back-breaking labour and humiliation. They received work that utilised their skills and treated them like valuable professionals. The disconnect between expectation and reality confused them initially. Many thought it was psychological warfare, that the British were testing them before real punishment began. They waited for the insult to manifest. It never did. The insult was the opportunity. The punishment was dignity. The defeat was purpose. Dieter Schneider died on November 17th, 1994. He was 73 years old. His obituary in the Sussex Express ran 3 columns and included tributes from the English Vineyard Association, from the German ambassador to Britain, and from the mayor of Lewis. The obituary mentioned his service in the Wehrmacht, his capture at the Rhine, his arrival in Britain as a prisoner of war, but it focused primarily on his achievements. 300 acres of premium vineyards, 2 children who both worked in wine and education, 47 years of contributions to English viticulture. Dieter's children donated his personal papers to the Sussex Archaeological Society in 1995. The collection includes letters Dieter wrote to his mother during 1946, describing his confusion about British treatment of prisoners. The collection includes the contract Charles Pemberton offered Dieter in 1947. The collection includes photographs of Dieter working the vineyard in 1946, wearing modified Wehrmacht work clothes because civilian clothing wasn't yet available. The documents tell a story that thousands of German prisoners experienced in Britain during and after World War II. They tell a story about expectations versus reality, about how punishment sometimes looks like opportunity if you're willing to see it, about how the worst thing that ever happened to you can become the best thing if circumstances align correctly. Dieter never forgave the war. He never romanticized his capture or his imprisonment. He understood that he'd been fortunate. Fortunate to be captured by British forces instead of Soviets. Fortunate to be sent to Sussex instead of a coal mine. Fortunate to be assigned to vineyard work instead of bomb disposal. Fortune, not virtue. Circumstance, not heroism. But he also understood something else. The British had given him a choice, not intentionally perhaps, but they put him in a position where he could succeed or fail based on his own decisions, his own work, his own willingness to adapt. They treated him like a man capable of building his own future rather than a prisoner whose future was determined by others. That treatment, that assumption of capability and potential, had changed everything. Dieter had arrived in Britain expecting to be broken. Instead, he'd been given tools to build. The British had called it prisoner work assignment. Dieter had called it confusion. History would call it one of the most surprisingly successful prisoner rehabilitation programs in British military history. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're finding forgotten stories like this every single day. Stories about ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Real people, real history. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure stories like Dieter's don't disappear into silence.